Good morning, gut buckets.
From around the world to your backyard.
Zuzu Radio.
Welcome to Zuzu Radio. I'm your host, Bran, and I'm here with...
Devin Kelly. I'm a freelance musician living in Buffalo.
Devin, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely.
So recently I was poking around online and I was looking for a new snare drum to replace the one I beat on for like over a decade or so. And I don't know how it happened, but I ended up on your page, Devin Kelly Music. And at first glance, it felt like a major discovery. It never ceases to amaze me how many people are out here operating at the local level unknown to me. And I've been in the game for quite a while now, so it's kind of a surprise sometimes.
Sure.
But it seemed like a good opportunity to meet up and learn more about the services you're offering Buffalo musicians. But also, before we dig into any of that, I just thought maybe you could tell me a little bit about when and how you discovered the drums, because there's always that moment where, you know, you encounter someone playing or you hear someone playing and it just strikes you. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I was super fortunate at a very young age to have very hip parents that played great music. And my grandfather specifically was a huge fan of jazz. And I mean, I started out playing piano. My mom, who was a saint, listened to us hack away. I have a brother and sister, and the deal was we all had to play in order to get the piano, which we all wanted to have in the house. So played that for a while, and you know, in grade school, I mean, everybody was a drummer, so it really wasn't an option. But the French horn is sort of what entered after piano for me, and I mean, I always knew I wanted to play the drums, but at the same time, you know, it was kind of a unique-looking instrument, and I dug the way it sounded. And soon I realized that the role, in many cases, within larger ensembles for the French horn is very rhythmic, and there's a fair amount of syncopation that takes place within the brass ensemble specifically. So I was all over that because it's like, well, I don't have drumsticks, but at the same time, I'm playing upbeats, and this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then as things progressed, I started begging my parents to try to take a couple drum lessons just to see what it was like, and ultimately they were good with it. And I was probably about 14 at that point, and really never looked back. The French horn did not last much longer than that, but that's okay. But the piano, I kept up until about high school, and then ironically ended up kind of stopping it. And then fast forward to, I would say, 6 years later or so, when I was halfway through my undergrad and decided I wanted to switch to a music degree. And of course, then it's like, well, you're going to have to play a lot of piano. So, well, maybe I should have just kept up with that the entire time. But it was a great experience. And yeah, I mean, ever since it's been drums in one capacity or another. I mean, first playing in bands, the jazz thing sort of surfaced a little bit later for me. And that was in part based on a lot of the music that had been given to me over the years by family members, specifically my grandfather, and also just as a student of the drum set, specifically realizing that if you really want to understand this instrument, you need to go back in time. And I mean, the instrument was literally designed around jazz. So that wasn't too hard of a leap for me to make once I started to really understand that. And I also realized that I had a relatively decent understanding for ensemble playing, being somebody that played in ensembles. So, I mean, it kind of comes full circle with the French horn and brass instruments and understanding blend and timbre and things like that. So I always have kind of chuckled at the fact that I kind of came to the drums by way of the French horn, which is not, I don't know that there's anybody else that could really say that. So.
Right. And there's, like you said, so much music theory that maybe a lot of drummers miss out on if they're only solely focused on the rhythm percussive end of things. And so you had this background that allowed you to kind of take the turn when you needed to, you know, and definitely got to give a ton of credit to the parents out there that allow their kids to figure it out, you know. A lot of listening to well, French horn, I don't know how bad that could sound. I mean, it's kind of a beautiful instrument. Like a violin, I imagine, screeching.
Right.
And drums, you know, are loud. And, you know, I give a lot of credit to my mom. She was always like, I love the drums. And I was like, wow, you're really cool. Thank you.
Sure.
So I'm just really curious, though, more about this sort of lineage, you know, grandfather down. Were these people in your family active gigging musicians, or how did they operate inside the music world?
They weren't at all. They were literally patrons of the arts. They loved to listen. They took us to concerts when it was possible. My grandfather took me everywhere, which was great. And I grew up on Long Island until about junior year of high school, midway through junior year of high school, and then my family moved up to Ithaca, New York. So I spent a handful of years in the Finger Lakes before moving on to the Rochester area. But my dad owned a restaurant, and they had jazz on Sundays. So that was
cool.
a big aspect of my formative listening, I would say. I had no idea what was going on, other than just sort of being bummed out that they would unplug the Pac-Man machine in the bar so the bass player could plug his amp in. But it was cool. And once I sort of wrapped my head a little bit more around jazz, and the other person there's actually two people that I would give a ton of credit to in terms of my development. I had a great middle school band teacher that I had no idea during the time was an unbelievably well-published percussionist, like world famous. His name was Murray Huliff. He's still around. He's retired. I think he lives in Jersey now. But he wrote like fantastic repertoire for all different percussion instruments, and he also directed the jazz band. He wasn't really a jazz player, but he was a lover of all music, and it was the coolest band to be part of because, we were playing Sam and Dave tunes for holiday concerts. it was great.
Yeah.
There's, I'm sure, a cassette floating around of me slowing way down trying to play Can't Turn You Loose just because I did not have the chops to keep that groove going.
Oh my God, the chops of the players on those songs in particular. We're going to have to circle back a little bit when we talk about some of the music that I listened to that you've made.
Oh, sure.
But for the time being, I just want to point out two things that seem true in a lot of musician origin stories, and that is having a great teacher that influences you and having the opportunity to access live music.
Definitely.
Those two things I also had and felt like without them, I really wouldn't be on this path. And it's something that concerns me a little bit about Buffalo and the lack of all-ages venues that right now, without Sugar City, which was a nonprofit, all-ages safe space type of venue, with that gone, it's hard. I teach students that are, under 18 and they don't have a place to be to experience it. So I think about that a lot.
Definitely, and I think, certainly with COVID, a lot of things have changed. I was a college teacher for a number of years, and my career came to a halt right around the time of COVID, and I still teach a fair amount of private students in my home studio. A lot of them are former students when I lived out west. But you're right. Having somewhere to go so that you can physically connect with music is key. And I think in some ways, not to sound like the old guy in the room, but what scares me a bit is just the idea of that not necessarily being prioritized anymore. And I think because we were all in our rooms and had access to sort of everything in life under our fingers, that sort of became was deemed kind of a worthy substitute for the live experience, whether it was music or whether it was just interacting with one another in any kind of social setting. And that's something that certainly is concerning for me, and I hear it in younger students, and it's certainly a factor that I think exists in this day and age. So kudos to anybody who is running all ages shows. That's how I first was able to play. There was a great club in Ithaca called The Haunt that it moved locations from when I used to play there, but they had all ages shows on Sundays, and my brother and I had a power trio, and we were ready to take over the world, and they let us play there.
What were you guys called?
It was great. We had several different names. I think the one that probably stuck the longest until we realized that there was already a band called Clutch was Clutch.
Okay.
And we were kind of just playing whatever was popular at the time. I'm 46, so I sort of grew up at an interesting era, and we moved at an interesting time. We moved up to the Ithaca area in 94. So I remember starting to play drums around 91 and playing along to cassettes in my parents' basement. And it was literally things like Poison and Def Leppard, because that's what was on the radio, Bon Jovi.
Yeah.
And then we moved up to Ithaca, and Nevermind and Soundgarden and all those albums came out, and then it's like everyone's wearing flannel, and now there's a totally different thing, and it really just changed things. But I felt super fortunate to kind of have been able to experience both aspects, or maybe ends of kind of the quote unquote rock spectrum, if you will.
Yeah.
And then a couple years later, 311 comes out, and then the Dave Matthews Band comes out, and so there's all these different sort of, I don't know, subcategories of popular music that were just really kind of happening all at the same time. So as a drummer, it was a very interesting time, going from wanting to have the huge double bass kit to then all of a sudden going to, I just want to have like a Toys R Us kit like Dave Grohl seemed to be playing, and just have it tuned so dead that it didn't even sound like drums. And one cymbal, not 7 and all that. So So it was a unique time for sure. But those all ages shows were key to my development for sure. And also I would throw in any school that offers a battle of the bands. That was the other huge thing. And we didn't win. We should have, but we were the new kids in town, so we got second place. But it is what it is.
You don't see many battles anymore. You really don't, and that would be a great place to start. Something actually I was running for a time, a 21 and under battle of the bands that was going through Sugar City before the pandemic. Had this whole thing worked out. Actually, was talking to Babeville about sponsoring the finale and doing this whole Guitar Center package of gear and stuff, and then pandemic took it away, unfortunately. But I want to circle back to something you were bringing up, which is the idea of the wider range of music you listen to, the better performance you can give, the better musician you become as you start to discover things. I learned how to play drums by listening to AC/DC Back in Black. That was like straight, just 4/4.
All you need.
Yep. It
still might be all you need.
It's a really good way in. But then, the more I stretched into territory that I was completely unfamiliar with, I'd find things that I'd want to bring back with me to my own music, Oh, I don't like everything in here, but I like this one little piece. Let me try it out,
Sure.
And so when I listened to the music that you're making, I couldn't help but feel this like really deep connection to something I had discovered in my early 20s. There was this Stax Records DVD where I believe in 1969 they took a band out to Denmark, probably. Sam and Dave were on the bill, Otis Redding, like a bunch of their big stars, and it opens with just the band playing. It's Booker T and the MGs is the backing
Al Jackson
band.
Jr.
Yes, exactly. And I was going to bring him up specifically because when I listened to that organ style, sort of jazz, sort of thing, it really called to mind a lot of the recordings that I heard from you, and I wanted to see if that is like a main point of reference for you, or is that something that just sort of came together?
No, it actually wasn't. We listened to those albums all the time when I was a kid. My parents played them basically. But what you're referring to is I have had an organ trio for a number of years, and we're talking about guitar, B3 organ, and drums.
Yeah.
And it's not a style, even within jazz, that I was super familiar with and it really kind of happened for me by necessity. So we left downstate, we moved up to Ithaca, and there was a pretty vibrant music scene for sure. The jazz scene was relatively specific, and I was young and a bit of an outsider. It's a college town, so the kids that were going to college and the people that I went to school with, some of their parents were professors, so it was very much kind of a niche thing. And I started to get into jazz pretty specifically right before we moved. I had a great teacher down on Long Island who was doing his doctorate at SUNY Stony Brook, named Ken Pasek, who is in New Jersey now, and still just unbelievable musician and just a beautiful guy, and very open-minded. He certainly came from a classical background. He was an unbelievable marimbist too, but he just liked all music. So he wasn't really a drum set guy. He wasn't a jazz guy, but at the same time, he respected the fact that that's sort of where my path was going, and did what he could to sort of help me along. And the biggest thing he did really was just, hipping me to some good records to check out, which was a big part of it. So then fast forward to living in Ithaca, that area, and wanting to try to find some other players. The irony was there was only one bass player.
It's only one?
There was an older guy too, but I was not old enough at that time to have really been able to kind of make too many connections. But I was in high school with the Ithaca High School Jazz Band at that time was quite good. There was a bass player named Miles Brown, whose dad, Steve Brown, is a super well-known guitar player and was the head of the Ithaca Jazz program for a very long time. and there was a great keyboard player named Adam Benjamin, who, if anyone's familiar with the band Kneebody, he's a founding member of Kneebody.
Oh, cool.
So when I moved up to Ithaca, that was the rhythm section.
Wow.
And there was another drummer who was a bit younger, but was also very good. So, I mean, I could not hang with that. So those guys were sort of doing what those guys did, and they went out. They were a little older. They went off to school. And then I graduated, and I went to Geneseo. I started as a biology major, psychology, and then eventually music. But where I came into the whole organ trio thing was when I would be back in town. I had become friends with a good piano player who lived down in Elmira named Dino Lucido, who also happens to be a fantastic organ player. So because there was no bass, because Miles was gone, I still wanted to play, and he was a great organ player. And I really knew nothing about that genre or subgenre within jazz, other than I know that I loved the sound of it, and it certainly grooved, and it kind of, hit me in the heart just as much as it hit me in the head.
Yeah.
And he and Steve Brown, actually Miles's dad, had a group, and I was able to play with them quite a bit, and they kicked my butt in every direction on a very regular basis. And what was unique about that style, and kind of referencing the Al Jackson aesthetic, is I came up playing a lot of notes based on what my background was up until that point. So I had pretty good technique. I was very good at reading, just due to kind of having the classical background a bit. Fusion, all those things. I mean, when you develop a modicum of technique, then you kind of want to see how far you can go with it.
Yeah.
And then certainly that was what turned me on to jazz too, was just the idea of, so I can play anything I want. And you start listening to the different, bebop pioneers with just unbelievable musicality in addition to technique, and that was certainly something that grabbed me. But what was really cool about the organ trio aesthetic was that less was always more. And it also, in playing with those guys specifically, and in playing a lot of that kind of jazz, shone the light on the fact that there are other things that I really needed to work on. Certainly improving your time, dynamics, because the organ especially is one of the most dynamic instruments around. I mean, it can go from a whisper to a roar in a matter of milliseconds.
Yeah.
And Dino is one of those players, in addition to being great with bass pedals, that he really knows how to make that instrument speak. And that was a tough one for me to just try to figure out how to play with. The bass notes coming out of a Leslie do not feel and sound the same. The attack is totally different than an electric bass, and certainly an upright bass too. So there was a learning curve there for me, and so it sort of all came about through necessity, because I wanted to play. Here's what was available, and we just had to kind of figure it out.
Yeah. One of the best ways to get better is to play with other people that are better than you. But
Totally.
the opportunity to do that it's not often available, because you've got guys that want people that are at their level, so it's really nice that you had that opportunity. But I guess maybe this sort of transitions us into one of the things you offer is lessons. And I guess I wanted to sort of get your understanding of the idea is to be great, you've got to practice, right?
That's true.
And maybe you could tell me, what are the keys to becoming great? Is it, you're in the woodshed for 10 hours running rudiments, or is there more to it than that?
I think there's definitely more to it than that. I think probably the most important thing, regardless of instrument or maybe even subject, is to understand how you, the individual, learns best. So it was kind of weird for me, because I was a very visual learner. In many cases, I still am. For music, obviously, it's an oral art form, right? So, and I kind of think about my brother all the time, who is a great musician as well, and we're completely polar opposites in pretty much every aspect musically. He is just unbelievably talented in a very raw way. He's a metal guy. He looks like a professional wrestler. I mean, he could bend me in half, with one hand. But he learned one way, and I learned a different way. So being in a band with him was great, because we're trying to learn a tune, and I would transcribe it because I wanted to see it, even though obviously that is an oral connection too to the music. But he just needed to hear it, and he could get that together. So to get back to your question, I think the most important thing first is you've got to set yourself up for success. So you need to understand how that happens. So are you a visual learner? Are you an oral learner? Are you a little bit of both? And I think initially it makes sense to probably lean into what you're more comfortable doing. But I think also if you truly want to get good, you have to also face the music, no pun intended, and understand where your shortcomings are. So I think in many ways, trying to thread that needle is the key first. In terms of practicing, I think it's different for everyone. I'm a practicer for sure. When I practice, and I become obsessed with it. And when I was younger, hours a day, I'll steer clear of all the how many hours a day cliches, but it was something that was very regimented for me because in my personal opinion, and maybe my parents would be the only ones that would beg to differ, I really had no talent. I was just a very hard worker, and I loved it, so that is what helped me get good.
Were you chasing greatness with the practice? What was the level? What were you looking at in the distance going, I got to get to this. I want to be able to do this?
I was a quiet kid, so what I wanted was to be part of a bigger thing. So that was what attracted me to the drums especially. I didn't have a big personality, so the idea of getting to stand in the back of the ensemble was fantastic. It's like I'm contributing, I'm part of it, but I'm not in front. My brother's the one that would be in front and is happy to be there every day. But for me, I think what I was truly trying to chase was how can I make the band sound really good? Because I kind of felt like, well, this is my contribution. And coming from a little bit more of a classical background, plenty of days went by where, I would be standing in the back counting hundreds of measures to play a triangle part.
Yeah.
And in a way, early on, it was kind of like, this is ridiculous. I should just get an instrument where I can play all the time. But both of those teachers, in their own kind of roundabout ways, said, there really are no small parts. There's just small musicians. So if you want to contribute, that part matters. Think about that. It's key. And I did. And that really, I think, is what kind of set me on the path to greatness. I'm not a solo guy. I want to be part of the ensemble. I want, certainly within a jazz context and with an improvised music context, I want to be part of the conversation. So it's not that I necessarily just want to sit back and, and play time and chop wood and just sort of be a reference for everybody.
Yeah.
But that is a big part of what the drums are about, historically, certainly. So I think that aspect is key. So for me, it was all just about how can I get better at contributing to the big picture.
I think there's some sort of psychological study that can be done on the idea of being. There's a weird dynamic here. You're in the back of the band, right? You're kind of like,
sure,
I'm more comfortable in the back, but you're on the loudest, potentially
I am
instrument.
playing the loudest instrument.
And a lot of people at shows, they look right at the drummer.
Sure.
They're watching all the limbs go, And to watch a guitar player, there's fingers going, but maybe it's not as exciting to watch. So There's a really interesting psychological underpinning there. I'm not sure what it is, but something is happening there.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, for sure.
So I saw a video of you, and it looked like you were sharing wisdom all the way across the world in Beijing. I think it's like 2018 or something. So knowing your teacher, is this a common or current practice where you're traveling the world and doing this, or do you keep it on a more local level normally?
I keep it on a local level physically, but the beauty of if there was perhaps an upside to COVID and things like that, was it, for me personally, it really forced me to get my my IT chops, if you will, together. And the video that you saw was from a student outreach trip that I took. I've taught in various iterations for quite a while. Almost since my undergrad years at Geneseo, which is where I went to school. Lots of lessons, and then I moved out to Los Angeles after I finished my graduate work at University of Rochester, the Eastman School of Music. So in 2006, I moved out to LA to be a player.
To make it.
Yeah, absolutely. Packed up the wasn't the minivan, because the back door of the minivan was being held on with the bungee cord at that point. So
You don't want any drums to go flying out the
no,
back.
but I bought a used Honda Element with the help of my dad and worked in restaurants for about a year and a half to save up as much money as I could and loaded up and went for it. And was out there for about 14 years.
Wow, so you had a good run.
I did. It was great. And it was an interesting time. It's a very interesting city, especially with regard to what's going on now. I mean, my heart goes out to so many people. It's brutal. I mean, I wish I was a millionaire because the number of GoFundMe campaigns I would be contributing to, that's really what people need right now in a very immediate way, aside from the texts and just, phone calls just to check on how everybody's doing. But I moved out there to be a player, and I was playing quite a bit. And what I was able to luck into was also to teaching. And I always loved teaching. I always loved having good teachers. And I remember when I was fortunate to have great teachers that they often talked about paying it forward and that it is important, especially if we want these art forms, whatever style it is, to sustain themselves. We need people to be able to play these styles, but also we want them to respect and love and listen to them too. So I always knew that I would teach in some capacity. And I mean, certainly in a city like Los Angeles, where the cost of living is very high, it was kind of a win-win for me because it was a way to supplement my performing income while also giving back and paying it forward and doing something else that I really loved. So I taught at Musicians Institute for about 8 years. First as a drum set instructor, so lots of private lessons. And then ultimately I ended up full-time faculty within the bachelor's program. And then took administrative roles, the last of which was curriculum coordinator. And while I was teaching within the bachelor's program, we had opportunities to travel. That school is really great in that it's a very diverse student body. It's primarily international students. So we would go to China and to Korea quite a bit, which is, I would say, probably where the majority of the student body was as far as international students. They came from those two countries specifically. So it was great because they would put trips together. We would go for 2 or 3 weeks. We toured China quite a bit. When it was Korea, it was pretty specific to Seoul, but visited different performing arts schools. There were some jazz camps. There was the Beijing Jazz Festival was happening that year. So we had a faculty group that was able to perform. So it was fantastic. So my website, which is devinkellymusic.com, is really just kind of a collection of all the different experiences I've had as a player, but other aspects of my life too, and certainly that includes teaching.
Yeah, right. One of the other huge services you offer is rentals, which was the thing that was like really exciting and impressive to me because I guess it's a little bit of a niche market, but having it here, I think about it in terms of like film. There's a lot of crews that come through Buffalo, tax credits and whatever, maybe there's like Hollywood people here shooting. And when they're here, they need to rent gear. And if there are people here that do provide that professional level gear and it helps the whole thing churn, the industry comes knowing that they're going to be supplied. And so I saw your lineup and I thought, wow, this is really great because when killer players want to come through and need to have access to that level, you're offering it. So I guess just a couple questions about it, like how many pieces do you have and how did you end up with all this like really great stuff?
I've collected quite a bit of gear over the years. A lot of that was basically just through kind of chasing a different sound. So, I mean, as somebody who was certainly enamored with jazz, I mean, the Grush Bebop kit was sort of the holy grail for a long time. And I was very lucky to come across one of those at a great drum shop that's actually still around, Dale's Drum Shop outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So, I mean, it wasn't something that and even the rental thing wasn't something I set out to sort of go after as some sort of business enterprise. It was just something that sort of happened because I started getting a couple calls periodically for people coming through town or a couple different festivals that just needed gear in the same way that you're mentioning it. And I mean, it was the same thing for me too. I mean, even those trips to China, I mean, you have no idea what you're going to end up with. Fortunately, the gear over there, especially in South Korea, is like through the roof. I've never seen nicer backline in my life.
Really?
It's crazy. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
I just kind of started collecting, and then a lot of it also had to do with just different styles of music I was playing. In addition to playing and being on the jazz scene quite a bit in Los Angeles, I fell into other areas, some of which was studio work, and generally that's kind of a different sound, tonally, certainly size-wise. So, you amass gear as you kind of move through your career to an extent. And that's sort of how it happened. And I've got it all at my house. My girlfriend's a saint, just, knowing how much I have. But a couple of friends that were coming through town, needed drums. And I was able to kind of make that happen. And then, it sort of snowballs from there. It's not a huge enterprise. And generally speaking, it seems to be, based on a lot of the gear I have, it's more of a jazz sensibility in terms of the people that are going to request it. So, but it's worked out great. The Albright Knox has a really nice jazz series through Jazz Buffalo. That's going to start in a couple weeks. I think their first concert is on February 2nd. So they initially reached out, and I'm super happy to provide drums for the different national artists that come through there for sure. And it's a great way. I would go to those concerts anyway, so it's kind of a nice opportunity. Some of the drummers that come through town I know, so it's just a great way to reconnect, run down to Cole's and have lunch before sound check or whatever it is. And then some I don't, but it's a great way to meet people too. And it's been very cool. And the caliber of musician that comes through Buffalo on a lot of those concerts especially is pretty high. We're talking about Eric Harlan, we're talking about Matt Wilson, Sherry Miracle is going to be coming in a couple of weeks, I found out. So that'll be great. I think she's still the percussion professor at NYU, but she also has the Diva Big Band Jazz Orchestra, which is an all-female staffed big band that's been around for probably about 30 years. And that's actually a big band my grandfather took me to when I was in high school to go see.
That's really cool.
Down in SUNY
Full
Binghamton.
circle.
So yeah, it's very interesting how it's all full circle. And she
Yeah.
and I were texting today, and I said, "You're never going to remember me, but I'm happy to get to see you again in a couple weeks." So,
That's so cool.
so
Community.
yeah, it just came around, through necessity. And we've all been there. You get buddies, you go into you're sharing gigs, or you're in another city and you don't know where you're going to walk into. And I've definitely had my fair share of horrible experiences, traveling very long distances to just find completely the wrong kit for what we're going to be playing.
Yeah, nothing worse than a trashy house kit that you get stuck with.
It's terrible. Or, even sometimes nice festivals, they just don't get it, or maybe it's, you're a piano trio that's completely acoustic, but the band before you is more of a smooth jazz band. So the bass drum head's ported and they've got clear heads on it, and you're going to play brushes for the next hour and a half. And,
Right.
Now you're not, because no one's going to hear it. So
Yeah,
you
it
have to
doesn't
kind of
work.
rethink that.
Yeah.
So, it's a service, but it's really just, another way, I guess, if there's sort of a theme of today for me, it's just about paying it forward.
That's very cool.
It's to my benefit for artists to come through town and sound their best, because I get to experience the positivity and they get to have a great time, and that's infectious and works its way into the music, and it works its way into the ears of everybody else, and everybody wins. So, why wouldn't I not do that?
Are there any pieces of gear that are overly sentimental to you where you would be like, you know what, this one's going to stay out of the rental rack. It's going to just be for me?
Yeah, I've got a few. And there's definitely some gear that I would not rent for live shows. I got really lucky about a year and a half ago and came across, through a buddy who has a great drum shop in Rochester, Cadence Drums. He had an old customer that unfortunately had passed away, and the widow reached out and said, so-and-so recommended that I talk to you. I know you knew my husband, and I got to figure out what to do with these drums. So I literally kind of was in the right place at the right time, and I walked into like a mint condition early 80s Yamaha recording custom drum set in a pretty rare finish called quartz gray, which if you're a big Yamaha drum nerd, Dave Weckl played the red kit, Steve Gadd plays the black kit, Vinny Caliuta played the white kit, and Peter Erskine played the gray kit. And I was just kind of stunned. I didn't have the money at the time to really buy it, but it's not something that you just walk away from. So I bought it. And that kit sits in my home studio for sure. It would take a pretty unique situation, and probably musically so too, for somebody to want to play those, because it's, I mean, it's kind of a timepiece of a sounding kit. It's not something that you really hear these days. I mean, with the exception of somebody like Steve Gadd, who's only ever played that drum set, regardless of, who he's with. But it's got the suspended floor toms. I mean, that really hasn't been in vogue for a long time.
Yeah.
But when you hear them, it's a sound. So, I could potentially see something like that going to a very nice studio for, a very specific reason. But otherwise, I would probably just prefer to keep that one at home.
For sure. And all of your drums have Aquarian heads. Is that right?
They do. Yeah.
And why is that? What is it about Aquarian that's like, yes?
So, I mean, for me, initially it was durability. I mean, I was a college student and I was practicing up a storm. I was trying to get my brushes together especially, and I've always just been kind of a coated head guy. So, I mean, I would say Remo Coated Ambassador is probably the style of head that more people are familiar with than the Aquarian texture coated, but they're the same thing. It's a 10 millimeter single ply white coated head. Mm-hmm. And I bought one of those because my buddy at the drum shop said, these sound really good. They're a little thicker coating wise, so they last longer. And boy, did they. I mean, I could go through a Coated Ambassador in about 3 weeks if I was really practicing. And I mean, 3 years, and a lot of times the Aquarians still sound good. Some people don't love them because they are a little bit thicker. They do kind of have maybe a slightly different sound, but over time, I've just kind of gotten used to that sound. And then the other reason was that really famous drummer Roy Burns from the Dorsey bands, he was the owner of that band, of that company. He founded Aquarian.
Oh, okay.
And I remember buying one head, and it did not last. All of a sudden, the coating chipped off pretty quickly, and I was kind of stunned because that was not the case. And I mentioned it to my buddy at the shop, and Roy Burns called me and said, "Hey, I hear you have a problem with our snare head. I'm going to send you 2. I'm sorry that happened."
Oh, wow.
That's not normal. And I said, "I know, but I mean, I was a convert for life from that point on."
That's so cool. Wow, a phone call from the man himself.
It was pretty great. Yeah, and then I went to the Percussive Arts Society convention a couple years after that, actually with my first teacher, and Roy happened to be at the restaurant we were at eating dinner, and pulled up a chair at his behest, and we shared some wine, and it was awesome.
Random
but
and
just
wild,
totally
yeah.
great guy, and a visionary that, I mean, he didn't have to do that. I mean, there's no reason he had to do that, but he did, and that was pretty amazing. So why would I not, continue to support a company like that?
Yeah. Yeah, and those little gestures go a long way. And in talking about paying it forward, like we've said a couple times in this conversation, someone probably did that for him.
Absolutely.
Made it personal, and he was willing to do it for you, and now the same goes along. It's just such a nice way to just keep it moving.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he was a gem of a person, and I didn't know him very well. I saw him a couple times, especially out in Los Angeles. I'd go to the NAMM show, and he'd be there hanging out, and I'd reintroduce myself because at that time, by then he was pretty old, but always just a sweet guy. And I mean, I love drums. I love collecting drums, but I don't know that I'm necessarily like an insane gearhead like some people are. But what I do appreciate and respect is quality. And I mean, even when it comes down to a drumstick or to a snare head, some those kind of expendable pieces of gear that aren't really designed to last forever. I mean, that stuff still matters.
Yeah, it makes a difference for sure.
And it is the conduit to how you make your art. So,
right.
It's a big part of it.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about lessons. We've talked about rentals. I think we got to talk about DPK Records, which the P, is that a middle name?
Yep, my middle name is Patrick.
Okay.
Yeah, nice Irish boy. So.
Yeah, Kelly has the last. Yeah,
Yep.
It's great.
Yeah.
Tell me about your live recording philosophy, because I understand. I mean, from my perspective, I am a huge fan. I love bleed. I call them accidents, but some people might call them mistakes. But whatever the moment, it's all there in the recording. I love that. Speak to how you came to that place for yourself and how you operate in the studio.
I mean, there's certainly varying philosophies on the concept of recording and making a recording, right? I mean, it is a tangible physical document of a specific experience that people have together at a specific place and time. I view it that way, but I also don't necessarily view it as being the be-all and end-all. It's not the definitive document. It's how we sounded as a group that day.
Yeah.
In those conditions.
It's that
And
moment.
Those can be adverse conditions. They can be ideal conditions. But, I mean, for me, and especially in recording improvised music primarily, the idea is for it to be different every time. So even though it's an album, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we would never play it the same way live. I mean, it's not possible, and it's not something that we kind of chase. So, I mean, for me, I always wanted whenever I had the opportunity, or when I started thinking about trying to record albums for my own band, I wanted it to be like a concert. And I wanted the fidelity to be such that it would be as close as possible to what it would sound like if you were in the room with us. And that's kind of, I think, atypical, certainly now, especially in the age of what's feasible digitally. I mean, you can make perfection, and you really can. Obviously, it's subjective, but I mean, you can get there, and that's not anything that I was ever really interested in for the reasons that I just kind of mentioned.
Yeah, it can sound very sterile.
Yeah,
And cold when
yep.
you're perfect.
Yep.
It's the mistakes or the accidents that give it that human life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even instrumentally too. I was just texting with a buddy who, actually my buddy Justin, who owns Cadence Drums, and we were talking about the fact that, I mean, some high-end drums sound so perfect because they're made so perfect that in some ways, like, they don't have much of a soul, and you kind of need, you know, a little bit of roughness or dissonance, you know, to really kind of give you a little humanity to the tone itself. Just kind of as an aside. But I mean, for the record label, I mean, that too kind of came about through necessity. I mean, I knew I wanted to make recordings. I was already living in Los Angeles, but I kind of felt like I had a little bit of unfinished business because my two friends who I played with quite a bit in the organ trio, Dino, and actually one of my professors from my time at Eastman, Bob Snyder, who's the guitar faculty, we played together a lot. And as opposed to trying to sort of put something new together in this new city, it kind of felt like, well, but every time I go home, like, we play. So what if we just got together in a recording studio, and there's a great one down outside of Ithaca, and just sort of played. We'll play our set, and the chips fall where they may. And that was the least expensive recording I've ever been part of, and in some ways probably the best, just because we just rolled in. It was kind of a day like today. It was snowing. You know, we hit record and we basically played our set. And if, you know, I think there were maybe 2 or 3 tunes we played twice, but the majority of that record is our first takes. I mean, it was just like, well, that's what we sounded like last night, so let's see what we sound like today and go from there.
Is DPK, are there artists that, let me put it to you this way, like, does DPK have artists that are not projects of your own? Do you, and if so, how do you select other people to come in and record and be released under this banner?
Sure. I mean, initially it was for my own projects. So I've got 2 albums under my own name, you know, the Devin Kelly Organ Trio. I was joking with my girlfriend last night because I appear to put out an album about every 8 years. So 2025 would be year 8 from when I did the last one. So I am due, and I actually I'm going to be, I think, doing a double album with a couple friends.
Oh, cool.
I don't think it's going to be trio, but it's not going to be organ trio. It's going to be piano trio, which will be great. But to answer your question, it's something that I was always interested in pursuing. If people were interested in sort of adopting, or not adopting, but if they saw things the way I did in terms of what albums are for and what they're about. So for me, that meant, you know, the live concept as much as possible, you know, minimal overdubs, things along those lines. So initially that was sort of my mindset. Over the years, I've kind of relaxed it a little bit, certainly with just how technology has changed, because it's pretty hard to do that. And, you know, you want people to be able to give their best performance. And if they're totally stressed out about, you know, the idea of like, wait, so you're saying we can't go back and do this and all that, that's a different animal. So there is one group in town. There's a trumpet player named Jacob J. and he has a band with his buddy Dalton Sharp, the J Sharp Tet, and Jacob approached me, having kind of known a little bit about my background when I moved to town, which was in the fall of 2019, and he was interested in doing an album, and just kind of wanted to get a sense of like, what am I walking into? Like, how does this all work? And I taught some music business and some recording concepts when I was teaching at MI. That was one of the things that I worked on with a lot of my drum students specifically. And then having done it myself, I kind of had a bit of a background. I mean, like I said, DPK came around because I just wanted to put out my own music, and it sort of seemed like I would be taken more seriously if there was some sort of attached label, regardless of whether it was me in my studio apartment or, in a big building. It sort of felt like maybe I'll be taken more seriously if I do
came
this.
to the exact same realization. I was like, if I make it look like it's bigger than it is, or there's something between me and it, it's a more comfortable feeling.
Yeah, and I think too that was kind of the influence of LA, just because everybody sounds so important, and everything they do just sounds so important, and in many cases it is. But I mean, as a young guy, in my late 20s, trying to figure out how to rub elbows and kind of see how this whole industry works, it sort of made sense to me. So I did help Dalton and Jacob put their CD together. They recorded it locally and did all of that. So they kind of had that aspect down, but we talked specific details about certain aspects of things, it was all their music. I don't think there's any covers of any kind on there. So we talked about ASCAP versus BMI. We talked about these little things called ISRC codes that you want to make sure are part of your master so that you can get credit when it's played, if it's played, and all that. So in a way, I sort of became a little bit more of a mentor type of a concept, and they were interested in, do you think you could help us put it out? And I said, sure. And they said, well, do you think we could put it out on, your label? And I don't have any agenda with regard to that. I was kind of flattered, that younger guys who are hungry to sort of figure things out would approach me and, want help. And, so we made it happen.
Yeah.
And they're doing great. The album came out. I helped them kind of navigate some of the radio airplay waters, which are certainly nebulous. And I think they had a pretty successful first release. I know that they are working on a second release, and I think that one, unless they reach out to me again, will be something that they do on their own, and that's great. I'm happy to be sort of, a conduit or sort of. Just sort of an information repository for what people like that have to offer. And once again, I think it kind of comes back around to you can pay me and I can do all this for you, but at the same time, maybe we should figure out some sort of middle ground so that you can do a bunch of it for yourself and learn some things and kind of go from there. Because that's the other big challenge, I think, certainly in this day and age. It is an industry, it is a business. So even though physical CDs and things like that aren't as prevalent anymore, there's still very much an industry that wants to sort of get paid to help you do things that you could probably figure out how to do yourself if you maybe had somebody point you in slightly a right or more correct direction. And I think. It's the DIY mantra, right? That's the whole point. And then you amass all this great information that you can use and maybe impart to others down the road.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's great advice. Sometimes it's about instilling enough confidence for someone to become competent,
Yeah, absolutely.
And that goes in two different directions, but that's the way I see it, is just always remembering that it's not all about what's in your bank account at the end of the day. It's sort of about the community you're a part of and how you can be a part of the fabric of the community. What is your role at that particular moment in time, and what do people need from me? And so, like you said, sometimes it's not always about let me do it all for you. Sometimes it's about let me do half of it for you and then show you the next doorway to pass through. So I think that's excellent advice. Something that I hope people keep in mind as they're operating.
Yeah, it's so easy to get taken advantage of.
It is, yeah.
And it's an industry in many cases that is sort of designed around maybe not purposely taking advantage of people, but carving out these niches that sound very unique, very important. And in many cases they are, but sometimes just a little bit of elbow grease and legwork, and you can accomplish quite a bit. And that was kind of what blew my mind about putting my first album out. And I mean, it making, end of year charts in bigger cities. I mean, I was just mailing CDs and sending emails. And if something actually got played, I'd send a thank you note, and then it would get played again. I mean, doing that versus, spending $3,500 to get, a corporate radio playlist and contact sheet, you can find all that. Yep. So why would you spend that much money? That's enough money to make 2 more records. Especially now if you're not going to make physical CDs, and you can just self-release it digitally.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a good place to shift into sort of a lightning round, if you will.
Oh, sure.
So I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff at you, and you can give me sort of short form what you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
My first question is, mono or stereo overheads? Which way do you lean?
Stereo now, but I certainly love mono for just the humanness of what it is.
Yeah. And so many old classic recordings are just done with that mono overhead, and you get to know that sound, and I think there's something just really classic about it.
Yeah, the best thing that one of my, actually the engineer on the second record who taught audio engineering told me is just buy one really good mic and figure out how to make your band sound great with that mic. Because that's what everybody was doing back in the day. I mean, there was maybe 1 or 2 mics max, and certainly for the drums, and as a drummer, I mean, you can put mics on everything, but knowing how to balance your sound and getting that to be conveyed through one microphone is pretty important.
Yeah, a huge education in what it means to mic. And then when you have 2 mics available, it's going to seem so easy.
Yeah. Yep. I am a big fan of the Glyn Johns approach too. If any audio nerds know what that is or want to know what that is, look it up. I think that's how we recorded the drums on my first record. And I mean, that sounded unbelievable to me.
Yeah, for sure. What is the best advice to strengthen your weaker hand? Are there specific rudiments or anything that you'd, offer up for how to get that other hand as strong as your primary hand?
I mean, for drums, I would say the key is listening first. And I mean, the way that it was explained to me, and I still do it, is like, well, your left hand is weaker than your right, so do twice as much with your left as you do with your right.
The math makes sense there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think in maybe the simplest approach, that's not a bad one for sure.
Yeah.
But I think the sound and also playing with the mirror so that you can sort of see what's going on. And that was something I picked up from a couple different teachers. I took a couple lessons with a really great orchestral player named Ted Adkatz, who is now out in LA, but he was with the Chicago Symphony for a long time. And he hit me to this whole thing of, if the sticks are dropping at the same heights and everything else, it stands to reason that you have a better chance of them sounding even. Mm-hmm. And I'm a traditional grip player now and have been for most of my life. And that kind of throws a rub in that because, you one hand moves in a completely different way as the other.
Yeah.
But even when they do that, there is still, I think, some truth to that approach. So I would say you want to work out your left hand more than your right, generally speaking. Try to do it in as musical way as you can, and try to still be relaxed, because the tendency is to get frustrated when one limb's not doing what you want it to, and then you tighten up, and then the sound changes, and then you're kind of chasing your tail.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. What's the best way to make a bad kit sound good on a budget?
Heads, I would say. I mean, if you have
Aquarian heads.
If you have the opportunity to be able to change the heads, I think that's a big part. If you don't, I mean, I've played the same drumstick for a very long time, but in extreme situations, I will try to explore that as well.
What do you play with? What stick are you using?
I use Regal Tips, which is a company that's actually local, Niagara Falls, been around for a long time. They sort of disappeared for a little while, but they are, I think, technically still back up and running. And I just bought a ton of those sticks when I sort of heard that they might be falling on tough times. So I still have
Stocking up.
maybe half a dozen pairs left. But it's I use the Regal Tip 8A Maple, which is a barrel tip stick. It looks a lot like the SD4, which is the Vic Firth combo stick that most people probably know because you see it a little bit more. But I got really interested in maple sticks. Most are made of hickory, which is a denser wood, but maple tends to flex a bit more. So for jazz and for really acoustic playing, I think you get a really nice clarity of sound, and they tend to be a little bit lighter also, which for me, I'm not a big guy, is helpful. Mm-hmm. But I think sticks and certainly heads can make, a relatively mediocre kit sound pretty good if you know what you're doing tuning-wise. Mm-hmm. And I mean, depending on the style of music too. I used to travel with gaff tape quite a bit. And, if you want kind of a dead sound, or if you have a really weird overtone that you just can't control because maybe the lugs aren't, super aligned because it's just a kit that's been totally beat, you can get pretty good mileage and kind of save some tone and smooth out some of the rough edges, I think, through some well-placed gaff tape for subtle muffling.
Yeah, for sure. Is Whiplash the greatest drummer movie of all time?
I've never seen it.
It's funny. A lot of drummers haven't seen it.
And the reason is because I sort of caught the vibe of what it was about.
PTSD of the
No,
the
that's the thing.
experience?
It was the opposite. But because I never had that environment. I guess without naming names, I came close in a couple instances during grad school. Not with a drum teacher, but with somebody else there that, now as I'm 20 years older and look back on it, he was right about a lot of things, but the delivery wasn't necessarily the best. And, you're dealing with younger people, so I think that's important. So I would say it's not the best in terms of, drumming movies of all time, perhaps.
Yeah. I think of it more like the Rocky of drumming movies where it's like, he's climbing this mountain and there's this big, moment at the end. I won't spoil anything.
Sure.
But it's worth a watch if you ever find yourself like, I don't have anything to do for 2 hours. I'll check
Yeah,
it.
at some point I will watch it for sure. I've had enough students busting my chops too over the years. Like, how come you've not seen this? Like, you're a teacher. I mean, you're not like that teacher, but like you do teach.
Yeah.
It's like,
As a film, it's just super well made. It's just a really fun ride to take. Even if it weren't about drumming, it'd be cool.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, final question. It's a big one, though.
Sure.
Who is the greatest drummer of all time?
I don't know that I can answer that. I mean, certainly me when I'm in my basement, but alone, not with anybody else. But I don't know. I think it's hard to say. To me, greatest probably is connected to versatility, so styles. So if I was going to pick somebody, it would probably be Steve Gadd. Rochester royalty. Played with everybody. I mean, Clapton, James Taylor. He's actually going to be with James Taylor. I just saw their calendar release. They're playing I think at the very end of June this coming summer. So, if you're a drummer, if you've never seen Steve Gadd play, it's kind of spectacular because it does not look like what you think it's going to look like.
Right.
But man, does it sound even better than you think it's going to sound. So I think because of so many different genres that he's sort of traversed, if I had to pick somebody, it would be him. I mean, there's other guys that are unbelievably versatile, but I think in some cases, if you ask them who the best drummer was, they might also say him because his influence is just so strong. But he's a great one for sure. I mean, I love those guys. I mean, obviously I'm biased because I really love jazz, but the guys that can really play jazz but also know how to play other kinds of music convincingly, I mean, that's where it's at as far as I'm concerned. And you were playing some music early, right before we threw the cans on and started chatting. And I mean, those were kind of the side gigs of jazz musicians. Those sort of easy listening, backing up vocalists, just super nice legato brushes with maybe a subtle backbeat when needed. That's it. I mean, that's another thing that I really love about jazz and what made me really want to study it was when I realized that, like I said before, I mean, the instrument was sort of built around that, but those players, many of whom were good enough and interested in changing with the times or sort of broadening their horizons, whether it was, through the need to make ends meet or just because they were interested, was pretty great.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it for me too. So I guess I would say Steve.
Very cool. Well, Devin, it's been really great getting to know more about what you do and what you're offering the community here, and just hearing your whole journey, and the idea of paying it forward as being a core principle for you really lines up with some of the work I do. So maybe this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Let's hope so. And for anyone that's listening, like I said, I moved to town. I'm a freelance player myself, and I teach as well. But anybody that listens to this that thinks they might benefit from having a conversation with me, I'm available to do that. Because at the end of the day, it's about strengthening the music of our community and feeding the souls of those who want to hear it.